Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's breakfast briefing. Bore da chi gyd, croeso mawr I chi, diolch am fod efo ni bore yma, braf iawn cael eich cwmni chi. Delighted to welcome you to this morning's breakfast briefing. My name is John Parry-Jones. I'm a business manager here at Cardiff Business School, and on behalf of the school, I'm delighted to welcome you all here to our breakfast briefing. This morning, our topic is being led by Jacob Schneebacher from the Office of National Statistics. And Jacob is hopefully going to provide some answers to the question, what do we know about management in Great Britain? And he's going to use the evidence and feedback from the Management and Expectations Survey as part of his presentation. So I'm really looking forward to that. Jacob, thank you for joining us this morning. Really grateful to you for your time. Before I hand over to Jacob, I'm just going to give you a few pointers to some of our other events that are coming up, and just a reminder as well that speech-to-text captioning is available to you this morning. If you would like to follow this morning's discussion with the benefit of text, then if you click on the closed caption option on the bottom of your screen, on the toolbar on the bottom of the Zoom screen, and click on show subtitle, you'll be able to follow the discussion with the captioning service. Hope you find that useful. We have breakfast briefings being lined up for the next few months. We're already into March 2022, which is frightening. Next month, on the 14th of December, we welcome Isabel Romilly from a company called Behaviour Change. And Behaviour Change, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, are experts in analysing our behaviour. Now, research tells us that most of our decisions don't necessarily happen through our own conscious control. And we regularly do things which perhaps are against our own interest or those of society. So Isabel and her team are going to take a look at that, and they're going to explain why that happens and what we can do to try and address that situation. Isabel and the team, they worked very closely with Cardiff Council recently on the campaign to try and reduce the amount of chewing gum that was thrown on the pavement. So they've worked very closely with Cardiff, and they're going to feedback on that project for us too. On January the 25th, we will welcome at last Professor Kate Dawn. Kate was due with us in September of this year, but we postponed that into the new year. Kate's going to look at disinformation specifically in relation to how it's affected our responses during the course of the pandemic, and how it's influenced our decision-making and society, and probably continues to do so. So really looking forward to Kate joining us then. And then building supply chain resilience on St. David's Day. Dr. Yingli Wang is going to join us to discuss how we can perhaps accelerate bringing on new suppliers and improve the transparency and the relationship between suppliers and buyers. We're looking towards the future, thinking that at some point, perhaps in the spring, we'll start our face-to-face sessions back in the suite. That would be nice. So watch this space. If you do have any ideas of future briefings, any topics that you'd like us to discuss on your behalf, then please do contact me or any of the team, and we'd love to hear from you in that respect. Short notice in some respects for this event, which is being held tomorrow between 9:30 and 12:30. A celebration of the partnership between the university and the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, which is being held tomorrow. As you can see, a three-part seminar, we might say, initially starting with Professor Andrew Henley looking at the productivity challenge which lays ahead of us over the course of the next few years. Sarah Lethbridge then is going to chair a session on challenging rewarding work and basic income. And to conclude the morning, Professor Calvin Jones is going to join us to discuss the future of skills in post-pandemic Wales. As you can see, a stellar guest list and a panel joining us tomorrow morning. Professor Adrian Pabs is the Deputy Director of NISA, the Institute of Economic and Social Research. Sophie Howe, Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, and Kirsty Williams, former Education Minister, all joining us. If you click on the link to the registration page, it's not too late to register, but if you click on the link, you'll see a slightly more detailed agenda for tomorrow and the full list of speakers. So hopefully you'll be able to join us then. A quick note towards our Lean Six Sigma program, one of which is the Yellow Belt is coming up in a couple of weeks' time. These sessions are always well received with Professor Manish Kumar. these are probably going to be the last ones that we run online, not necessarily the case, but quite likely to be the last ones that we run virtually. So if you're not based in Cardiff, or if you prefer to do these courses from the comfort of your own home, this may be the opportunity for you to do so. Yellow belt in a fortnight, and a second yellow belt in February, and then the green belt after that. Also, I'm not going to discuss the Help to Grow program too much at this point, because before the end of this morning's session, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jane Lynch, who's the program director for Cardiff University or Cardiff Business School of this program. The program is in place to support and to help small businesses as they try and come through the impact of COVID and so forth. It's a great 12-week program, very intense course. Jane will give you greater detail later on this morning, but it really is a great program to be a part of. And on that note, I'm going to take a back seat now. Just a reminder that this morning's event is being recorded. And also, if you would like to pose any questions to Jakob after his presentations, please do so by entering your information, your question into the chat box. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Professor Melanie Jones, who's I'm very grateful has agreed to chair the next session of the morning to introduce Jakob and to take us through the Q&As. So Melanie, it's over to you for the next half hour, 40 minutes or so.
Okay, thanks very much, John, and thanks to John, Sarah and the whole team for putting on this interesting event today. I'm very pleased to be welcoming Jakob to join us today. For those who don't know me, I'm here not just, I guess, as a professor of economics within the business school, but particularly as the lead for the economic intelligence team within the ONS Cardiff University Strategic Partnership. So that is a collaboration between the two institutions, really aimed to improve the outputs of both organisations in terms of the data, the research and the education that we can provide. And I wanted to thank Jakob for joining us here today, not just to do this breakfast briefing, but for his whole range of activities that he's contributing towards that strategic partnership. So we already have done a series of workshops for academic staff. We have done student lectures, and actually linking back to a previous breakfast briefing, Jakob is involved in one of our collaborative PhD students, so an ESRC D2P sponsored PhD student between ONS and Cardiff University. But today I'd really like to welcome him to really engage with our business community. And I think it's the first time that we've been doing activities that have been very much outward looking. He's going to talk today about new data that's collected from ONS on management. And really, economists haven't been traditionally interested in management practice, not until relatively recently, when there has been considerable massive evidence suggesting the importance of management practice for productivity and economic outcomes. And that really links to, I guess, two initiatives that are currently key to the work of the university. One, the business school is involved in the UK Productivity Institute that my colleague Andrew Henley is involved in, and that's looking at the UK productivity puzzle, and particularly the case in Wales. And perhaps even more relevant to our business community, my colleagues in social science are involved in Propel Hub, which is essentially trying to transfer the kind of academic research we do on productivity and management practice to a practice-based audience to enhance productivity. So I'll try and put links to those things in the chat so that those who are interested can have a look at that. But all I want to do now is really to welcome Jakob, thank him again for his time this morning. He's going to talk about, I think he's going to talk about three pieces of analysis in one presentation. He's going to talk about, the current state of management practice in the UK, how that's changed during, obviously, this difficult time period of COVID. And I hope he's going to come on to tackle what I think are the key issues around what's the impact of management practice on economic outcomes. So, as Sarah said, please do put your questions in the chat, and I'll try and coordinate them at the end. But for now, I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you, Melanie, for your great introduction and all of your work on the ONS Cardiff Strategic Partnership. Thanks, John and the team for having me, and to everybody else who showed up this early in the morning to learn about management practices. So I'll just share my screen if that's possible. Okay. Are people able to see my slides?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, perfect. So just to say, this talk is based on 3 articles we released over the last couple of months that all are outgrowths of the latest wave of the Management and Expectations Survey, which is a collaborative project with academic partners in the Economic Statistics Center of Excellence. And I would also like to gratefully acknowledge funding from an ESRC grant that made the survey possible. Okay, I am by background an economic historian, so I always like to take a slightly longer term perspective at first. And so I think a good way to start thinking about this topic is in terms of a trend that academic economists have noted for a good decade now, which is that if we look over the last 50 years or so, the rate of investment in intangible physical capital, buildings, machinery, has been falling across the developed world, and more steeply in service-heavy economies, while at the same time investment in intangible assets, be that R&D and branding, be that organizational capital widely construed, or software assets has been on the rise, and those in the audience in the private sector might have noticed similar trends in their own business. I mean, as part of that, jobs that have organizational or managerial components have also been on the rise. So this is from a recent working paper by the OECD that uses jobs and sort of the task components of jobs to classify the organizational and managerial component across the economy. And what they find is that especially in recent years, a large share of jobs in the UK specifically are to some degree management-based or organizational skill-based. So about 10% of jobs are full-time, primarily managerial roles, and the total of 26% have some managerial or organizational component. Okay. So against that background, it is that we are asking, what do we know about the state of management in Great Britain? And hopefully over the course of the next 30 minutes, I'll get to talk a little bit about the distribution of management practices in Great Britain within industry, across industries, across regions, and over time. And then we'll look a little bit at how these management practices are related to business outcomes that we care about, in particular, the ability to adapt in times of uncertainty. And I'm sure you've all experienced some uncertainty over the last 2 years, as well as the role of management practices in innovation. Now, all of this work will be based on the data we collected through the Management and Expectations Survey, and I'll explain a little bit of detail upfront about that. I just wanted to be very clear about what this talk can and cannot deliver. So everything I'll be showing you are statistical correlations, but I won't be able to assign causality to management. I won't be able to say it is because of these management practices that businesses are able to adapt better, to innovate more, and so on and so forth. I'll talk at the very end about some academic papers in this wider literature that do try to get at this causal argument. And the second thing I'd like to say up front is that there are different ways of measuring management, both in terms of what practices are being captured in the data, and also sort of the perspective we have on those practices. So you could imagine going to the employees of a firm or directly to specific managers of the firm. In the management and expectation survey, we approach the firms and ask them about the practices they use. And of course, the picture you get from different perspectives might be slightly different. I will say though that our academic collaborators, in particular Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen, have applied very similar methodologies both in the UK before and in other countries around the world, and have generally found very robust relationships with measures of business success, from survival to turnover to productivity. So we do think that these practices are measuring something real and something tangible. Okay, I'll keep the bit about the survey itself short, but just to say that our ONS articles contain a lot more detail about the sampling and the survey construction. So if you're interested, please go and see that. What I will say here is that the last wave of the survey was collected in obviously very challenging times, particularly as a voluntary business survey. And together with colleagues in methodology, we've worked quite hard to make sure that we still get a relative large number and of high quality responses. And in the article, we go through a variety of ways to make sure that the results we find aren't driven by sample selection due to the specific circumstances of the pandemic. Just to give you a little bit of flavor on the response rates, they vary between sectors and regions in ways you would expect. We've had the worst response in human health activities because they were quite justifiably busy with other things, and London, which at the time that the survey was in the field was hardest hit by the pandemic, also had the lowest response rate. Okay, just to give you a quick glimpse at the questionnaire. So this is one of about 25 questions on management practices on the management expectation survey. It asks, in this particular case, what the most common response of a business was to problems. Did they not take any action? Did they resolve the problem but leave it at that? Did they try to ensure that specific problem would not occur in the future? Or did they have some sort of process in place to anticipate similar problems and prevent them from occurring in the future? And across these more than 20 questions, responses were then aggregated or grouped into 4 categories: continuous improvement, which we just saw, targets, which is about the range of targets that a business is setting, and also how it is cascading and communicating those targets down through the organization. Employment practices, which is about anything related to hiring, firing, promotion, and training of employees. And key performance indicators, which tries to capture the degree to which firms know and are keeping track and are communicating metrics that related to firm performance. Okay, so this is just to give you a little bit of context of what the survey does, but really the purpose of this talk is to see what we can say with the use of that survey for the state of management in the UK in the last couple of years. So this is just a bit of a roadmap of what I want to cover in the rest of the talk. Okay, so let's start with just what do we know about how diffuse these structured management practices are. And here I'm showing you the overall distribution across the whole economy for the 3 years that we have coverage of the aggregate management score. So this is just an average of the 4 categories that I've shown you before, and that's what we'll use for simplicity and convenience for the rest of the talk. But again, in the articles, there's a lot more detail, including breakdowns by management practice categories. So what we can see overall is that over the last 4 years or so, there has been a slight improvement in the average management score that seems to be driven by firms, by this lower tail of firms that previously had less well-structured management practices catching up with the rest of the firm distribution. And again, in the article, we do quite a lot to try to assess to the degree to which part of this might be a statistical artifact that comes from different selection processes in survey response in the pandemic, and we come away convinced that at least part of this improvement is real. So one way to see this is we're also looking at within firm changes for firms that were sampled both in 2016 and 2020, and we see sort of the same pattern. Okay, but where does this pattern come from? So this is maybe one of my favorite graphs of this series of articles. We show that if we break this overall distribution down by size bands, we can show that the previously less structured lower tail is essentially composed of small and medium enterprises, whereas large companies already in 2016 have quite widely adopted structured management practices. And then in the last 4 years or so, we see this catch-up growth of those smaller businesses. They end up looking more and more similar to large businesses. Now, there's interesting variation across industries and regions as well. So let me start with the industries. If you have not seen a box whisker plot before, it's just a way of capturing more information than just the average differences. So if you look at the yellow dot in the middle of the box, that is the average management score across broad industry groups. And you can see that there's some variation there. Other services seem to be very well managed, real estate less so. But both in the average and at the upper end, the differences between industries are not that large. Where we do see large differences is in the laggards. So the dot on the left, which denotes the 5% of firms in each industry that have the smallest amount of these structured management practices. Okay, so what can we say about regions? There's always going to be some regional dispersion. I think from a policy point of view, we probably would be worried if that dispersion was either very large or it was very stable over time, right? So if the differences are small and firms are moving positions in the ranking quite frequently, then I think we'd be less worried from a policy perspective, and that's exactly what we're seeing in this case. So there are regional differences. You know, in the latest wave, so for 2020, the Southeast and Scotland are leading on average management scores, and Wales finds itself at the other end. But really, if we look at the numbers, you know, these differences are swamped by within region and within industry variation. And also these rankings are fairly mobile. So for instance, Scotland used to be in last place in 2016 and now finds itself in the lead, right? So I think that's certainly a cause for optimism. Now, so if that's the case, if region and industry aren't strong predictors of management score, then what is? So here I've plotted the coefficients from an OLS regression. So that's a statistical technique that allows us to look at many of these dimensions at the same time. And we've standardized the variables in a way that we can compare the statistical magnitude across variables. So this gives us a little bit of a chance to investigate the importance of firm characteristics. And what we can see here is, first of all, these patterns are pretty stable across year. So that gives us some confidence that you know, what we're measuring is not just noise. And secondly, that in terms of so from a statistical point of view, the characteristics of a firm that are most likely to predict management score are simply the size of the firm. So larger firms are better managed. The human capital that firms' employees have, so as captured by the proportion of managers and non-managers with a degree or equivalent. And finally, for a given size and human capital makeup, younger firms also tend to be better managed. Okay, so that's just to have a sense of, you know, how the adoption of structured management practices varies across firms. But obviously, I mean, certainly, I would assume for the audience here, ultimately where the interest lies is, so, you know, what is the relationship between management and the business outcomes we care about? So the fact that we collected the latest survey in 2020 not only presented some severe challenges to response collection, but it also gave us some really interesting opportunities to look at particular practices where we think management might have an effect. So what we're able to do in the latest wave is collect data for both 2019 as a baseline and then 2020 to get a sense of how these quantities you know, changed as the pandemic was developing. And so what I'm showing you here is essentially just the distribution of the raw data. We grouped firms by bins according to their management practices, and then plotted homeworking or the change in homeworking rates across those bins, right? So to get a sense of, you know, whether better managed firms were in some sense able to adapt to these changes and adopt these new practices better than firms with less structured management practices. And you know, this is sort of the pattern we see here. But of course, you could say, Jakob, you've just told us that better managed firms are different along a whole range of characteristics. They're older, they're younger, they're bigger, they have more human capital. How do we know it's not it's not those characteristics that are facilitating home working. So we again made use of regression analysis to try to compare firms that were similar along these observable characteristics. Now, of course, there might well be other dimensions that we can't observe that could also have an impact. And this is why it's tricky to say there's a causal link from management practices to these outcomes we're interested in. But when we do that, once we strip out the effect of size and of age and industry and region, interestingly, what we find is there is no link at all between management practices and these pandemic outcomes in 2019. So no statistically significant relationship between management practices and home working rates for managers or non-managers, and between management practices and online sales. But in 2020, we get this positive and statistically significant relationship. So that suggests that it's not just better managed firms are firms that are doing more home working or online sales anyway. It's that once those adaptations become necessary, better managed firms seem to be able to adapt more easily. And this is also in line with some very new work, fresh off the presses, as they say, that our academic co-authors are doing. So this is a paper by, and I hope I don't forget any of the authors, Nick Bloom, Taka Kawakubo, Tatsuro Tsenga, Rebecca Riley, Paul Meisen, and John Van Reenen, where they use the expectations section of the management and expectation survey to ask if firms with better management practices are better able to predict outcomes 1 year out. And they're looking both at firm level outcomes as well as economy-wide outcomes. And in general, what they find across both micro and macro predictions is that better managed firms are making smaller forecasting errors. And so this is one graph from the new unpublished working paper. So do keep an eye out for that when it comes out. Okay, so I've shown you some evidence that firms were able to adapt better to the turmoil of the last year, and that they were also, in general, better at predicting both their own future path as well as the economy as a whole. So finally, before we wrap this up, let me show you some evidence from another recent article we published that tries to disentangle the link between management and innovation. And here the data comes from 2016, because this is the last year that we're able to match all of these surveys that we need to really say something interesting about innovation and R&D in relation to management practices. But we will update those results when the latest waves of the UK Innovation Survey and the R&D survey are available. So again, let's start from these very big overall patterns. What I'm showing you here is just the distribution of firms split by those that are R&D active and those that are not R&D active, as classified by ONS. And you can see that the R&D active firms have a higher mean, and in general, the whole distribution is shifted further to the right than non-R&D active firms. The other thing I think that I found quite interesting about this graph is that you can see that the non-R&D active distribution is quite close to the overall MES sample. And that's just a result of the fact that very few firms in the UK economy actually conduct formal structured R&D, as opposed to sort of wider measures of innovation. Now, whatever way we slice the data, industry, as I'm showing you here, region, firm size bands, we get the same pattern. R&D active firms tend to be shifted towards the right, so of the management score distribution, so tend to have more structured management practices. And again, we try to dig into sort of potential confounders a bit by controlling for other observable characteristics of the firm, and the effect or the correlation, the size of the correlation coefficient does not change much at all. Here I'm also showing you in turquoise or teal the same regression, but using a slightly wider measure of innovation from the UK Innovation Survey. So this captures some creative and innovative work in the services sector and some other industries that don't fall under the strict international definition of what R&D is. Yeah, again, there's some interesting additional results in the article, so do have a look if that is an area of interest. I'm showing you so we're looking at the type of innovation as well, and here I'm just showing you one additional result, which is about the sources of funding. And again, we can't say, I can't stress this enough, we can't say anything causal, but what we see as a matter of correlation is that firms with better management or more structured management practices are less likely to rely on UK government funding for their in-house R&D and more likely to seek private sector funding than those with less structured management practices. Again, in the article, we discuss a bit how that should be interpreted, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Okay, well, I'm keeping very good time. That's good. So let me just sum up what I've tried to convey over the last half an hour here. So the first thing is that I'd like the audience to take away from here is that the management and expectations survey seems to be a very useful tool to get sort of a bird's eye view of a particular set of management practices that seem to capture something real about how businesses are run. I've shown you some patterns both over time where we see this catch up among small medium enterprises with previously less structured management practices. I've shown you some patterns across industry and region, and the takeaway there is really that within industry and within region, variation is much more important than cross-region and cross-industry variation. And I've also shown you that variation seems to be tied to the size of the firm, the age of the firm, and human capital. I've then given you a look at how those management practices are tied to the outcomes that government, policymakers, but hopefully also the private sector cares about, by showing you that firms with more structured management practices were better able to adopt novel practices like home working and online sales in the pandemic, and that they also generally seem to be better at predicting uncertainty at both the economy-wide level and the firm level. And finally, we've looked a little bit at the link between innovation, R&D, and management practices, and again see that firms that do innovation and R&D look quite different on their management practices in ways that aren't explained by the observable factors that we capture in ONS business surveys. So I've been very, very careful to stress that all of the results we've shown you are correlations only. But I do want to point to a wider literature that tries to go beyond correlations to capture causal impacts of management practices. And I think I just want to highlight a particular paper by Bloom and Van Reenen, so Nick and John, who we're working with, and some co-authors, where a lot of credit goes to them for setting this up, but they pick a random sample of Indian textile plants, collaborate with a management consultancy agency, and provide to a random subset of those firms, provide management training. And what you can see here is a measure of quality defects for the plants that didn't receive management training in red, and those that did in black. So you can see that in this case, where they were able to disentangle correlation from causation, there does seem to be a causal effect of management training on firm performance measures. Okay, and there are other papers that try to recreate similar designs with econometric techniques, and I'm happy to point you in the right directions. There are also some links in the articles we published. And I think this is where I'm going to wrap it up. Again, let me stress that in our articles, because we do not touch the causal link, all we're showing is correlation. And I would also just flag up again that there are different ways of measuring management, and they might tell us slightly different stories. And I hope that that's something that we can investigate in the future. Now, before I open the floor to questions, let me just quickly make two announcements. One is that a write-up of this talk is going to be published on the Propel Hub blog that Melanie pointed out. The Propel Hub, for the important work they're doing to reach out to the business community. There will be links to all the articles. And then finally, next week, I'd like to flag up the next iteration of the ONS Economic Forum. As always, there will be a talk on the state of the economy, and then colleagues of mine will be presenting a spotlight piece of research on the impact of EU exit and COVID-19 on trade and services. And with that, I'll stop sharing and hand back over to Melanie.
Thank you so much. I think you've raised lots of interesting issues, and we've already got some questions in the chat, so I'll turn to those straight away if that's okay with you. And the first one, which was one of my initial questions actually, and I'll put two questions together, which are from Michael Baker and Stephen Hicks, and they're both really interested, as you might expect, in the Welsh findings. So can you explain anything further about really the drivers of perhaps the position in Wales? And they're asking really, is it a function, is it a Welsh effect, or is it actually just a function of the composition of the firms that we have in Wales? Have you done any kind of regression analysis to separate those two things?
Yeah, so that's, I suspected I'd get a question like that presenting in Cardiff. So again, I would first of all stress that the regional differences really aren't that big, and they get smaller once you control for firm characteristics. Now, of course, this only pushes the explanation back one step, right? We might still be interested, why is it that Wales has firms that are maybe smaller, maybe have less human capital, and therefore have less structured management practices. But again, I would also say the changes in the ranking between the years are fairly substantial. So this, if I had to identify an area of policy interest, I think there are other dimensions of regional differences that seem to be more prominent.
Okay, so I guess my reading of it is that we can't look too much at management practice to explain the kind of productivity puzzle that I guess is additional in Wales. Okay. Mm-hmm. And Alan Felsted has asked about the kind of policy implications. So he asked, do you agree with the Resolutions Foundation's recent finding that we should have an economy-wide approach rather than a focus on the long tail, which is not unique to the UK?
Mm-hmm. So I have to be very careful here. So let me just put the disclaimer that I'm happy to express my views, but they are certainly not those of the ONS. I think for those who haven't read the Resolution Foundation report, it's a very good summary of all the evidence on the topic, including quite a few of our own publications that are very fairly represented. I think as Professor Felsted points out, the argument that the Resolution Foundation is making is that the drivers of productivity really seem to be concentrated in the upper tail, and so we need to have a way of if we want to think about productivity across the economy, we can't just focus on the laggards, and I think that's certainly true. I would agree with that characterization in a personal capacity. I think to bring this back on the management and expectation survey specifically, the fact that we see fewer differences between firms at the upper tail means that we might want to think about refining our measures to capture what really distinguishes the superstar firms from other high-performing firms in future waves of the survey. We seem to be better at capturing differences at the lower end than at the upper end, but that's something for us to take away, I suppose.
Okay, and maybe I'll turn to a question relating to measurement. As you said, you used that kind of aggregate score, and I guess all of us wanted to know, what does that mean and what's included in it? So can you define, I guess the question from Andrew Hopkins is, can you define a bit more about what's included? And he's also interested in the kind of composition, I think, of the sample. So does it include finance, accountancy? In his experience, there are many more accountants in the UK than European companies. Sorry, my questions are moving around at the same time. And is those kind of composition effects perhaps explaining some of the results?
Yeah, so on the composition of the score, it's an average of those four categories that I showed you: continuous improvements, targets, employment practices, and key performance indicators. In the articles, we show results for the individual categories as well, and I would say they roughly track the aggregate results. We've also, although we haven't published these figures, played around with other ways of constructing the score rather than a simple average, and the patterns seem to be fairly similar. If anybody in the audience is interested in these specific questions, the questionnaire is published on the ONS website. And then on the compositional differences, so again, the specific sectoral mix on which we sample the MES is sort of slightly different from the mandatory ONS business surveys, and there are a lot of details in the article. But in general, I would say any of the results that I've shown you, we include industry fixed effects. So we're always comparing two firms within the same industry. So some of those concerns about compositional effects should be mitigated by them.
Okay, great. I think we'll need to come to a close now, but I think there are two questions. One is about the future of the survey. So if you could just say, maybe are there plans for the future? And then the other one, I think, probably leads nicely into your the final session that John's going to introduce, which is, and I know that, again, this will be a personal view, but what's your view on the Help to Grow program?
Okay, so I mean, on the future of the MES, I think we've had a lot of interest from both academics and government in the results of the Management Expectation Survey. So it is still an experimental survey, and there are no fixed deadlines, but we are hoping to put another wave in the field as soon as we can. On the Help to Grow scheme, again, this is in personal capacity and does not represent the views of the ONS. I would say one thing that is coming out from our work, but then also from the more academic work that tries to disentangle the causality argument, is that certainly well-designed management programs can improve business outcomes, including productivity. That is, I guess, separate from the question of whether that is the most urgent or most important dimension. And again, I would refer interested readers to that Resolution Foundation report. And of course, the exact impact of a particular scheme on firm outcomes will depend on how well designed and how resource intensive it is. So I don't have any personal views on the various schemes that are out there, but certainly a well-designed program should be able to improve outcomes for most firms on average.
Okay, great. And thank you very much for answering all those questions so quickly. You may want to have a look in the chat and get back to any that I didn't do justice in the time. But all I want to say is thank you again for such an interesting presentation, and really to hand back to John for the remainder of this session. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Jakob. So we've just referenced the Help to Grow program. One of the things that Jakob said earlier on, that there are opportunities for better managed companies. So I guess the question was how we could get companies to learn those skills. And the government initiative was the Help to Grow program. And as I said earlier, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jane Lynch, who is the program director here at Cardiff Business School. Jane, if you're there, are you able to join us? If you can turn your camera off, and maybe I think we've got some.
Yes, I'm
here.
I'm here.
And if you wanted to just outline some of the things that we've learned about the program over the course of this first cohort, and how it works, the mechanics, and what people will learn from it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you, Jakob. I think you've certainly given us all plenty to think about here. So I'm just going to share my slides, and hopefully you can see those. We just do a check with me to make sure that you can see this.
Yeah, that's great.
John.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So I'm really delighted to be able to announce that we now deliver the Help to Grow management program at Cardiff Business School. And we're currently in week 7 of our first cohort. So it's a very exciting time for us. And I would like to think that I can give you some evidence that, yes, it's certainly helping businesses. It's not just aimed at businesses which are startups. In fact, one of the eligibility criteria is that businesses need to have been trading for at least 12 months. And I think sometimes people feel that it's designed for startup businesses, that these management skills are only relevant to people who perhaps haven't had that experience of applying them. But that's far from the case. In fact, one of the businesses that we've got working with us currently on the program is actually in business for 30 years. And what they've said to us is that actually this program has helped them to rethink, particularly coming out of COVID, where they are now and where they'd like to be. And it's really they've given them a lot of new tools and techniques to help them reevaluate that. So I think really building on a lot of Jakob's points here, yes, the UK has a long-standing challenge with SME productivity. And I think the UK government published its productivity review in 2019, showing strong evidence that management skills and digital adaptation are key drivers of firm level productivity. But I think what I was particularly interested in was Jakob's slide, which looked at catch-up growth in management practices, largely driven by SMEs, which of course, if SMEs are 97% of our, or even greater, business population in the UK and especially in Wales, then this is the kind of news that we need. So even though we see there's huge progress, there's an awful long way to go. And that was definitely illustrated by Jakob's regional map, where he looked at that. So the Help to Grow management programme has been designed, and I think it's very well designed, if I'm honest, and feel very passionate about it. It's been designed by a group of universities. Unfortunately, we weren't in the early conversations as part of that design, but it's now delivered across the whole of the UK, but only to businesses which are accredited with a small business charter. And thanks to Andy Henley and Andy Davis, I know Andy Henley's online here today, we have that small business charter. So we have the eligibility to be able to deliver that programme, in that the staff that we have recruited here understand what it's like to run a business in a smaller business environment. So some of the challenges they might face. So these are some of the initial questions that we might ask you through the session. It's basically a 12-week delivery. And you basically have a combination of online webinars and some face-to-face sessions. And on top of that, you'll have so you have 12 different modules tackling different elements of management, and I'll just leave you with a slide of that in a moment. You also importantly have you're put into peer groups, so very small group working with other businesses. And I think that's what's really interesting about this program, is that we never really know which business leaders are going to come into this program, into this cohort. So we've got a range of businesses across Wales who are manufacturers, auditors, IT companies. We've got hospitality, we've got hoteliers, we've got a coffee business. We've got somebody who manages triathlons. So we've got a whole variety of businesses, and they're really, really enjoying learning from each other. So this peer mentoring has been really invaluable part of the process for them. And they're basically, during the peer calls, they build on what they learned during the workshop, and they discuss it in more detail relevant to their business. And then in addition to that, you receive one-to-one mentoring support from a business mentor who has been specifically matched to understand your business and has some experience relative to your sector. And so that we spend an awful lot of time matching those mentors with you. So they give you one-to-one support for approximately 10 hours over a 12-week period. And then there's lots of other activities and videos and resources that are available through an online platform called Canvas, which I have to say is a very user-friendly platform. But ultimately, what we want businesses to gain from this is their own growth action plan. So they take the knowledge that they build over the 12-week period, and then they discuss this in their peer call and also with their one-to-one mentor. And then they develop their own confidential growth action plan. So really good to be supported through that. Just to give you an idea of the delivery team, and I think it's not just about having a well-designed program, Jakob, it's about having it expertly delivered as well. And in cohort 1, this is what the delivery team looks like. So, really, really exciting time for us, and I think exciting time for the businesses. And the feedback that we're getting from them is testimony that it's working and that it's delivering what they'd hoped. But the important thing for businesses to remember that it's 90% subsidised by UK government. Up till now, over 10,000 small business leaders and senior managers have registered so far in the UK, not just in Wales. And I know there's a pot of money allocated for businesses in Wales. So, I really urge business leaders in Wales, don't miss out on this opportunity. That funding isn't going to be available forever. The total fee for the full programme is £750 or £65 a week. So we feel that it offers exceptional value for money, and that has been corroborated by the feedback that we've received. They say they can't believe what they're getting out of this programme in terms of how much it's cost them, and that's actually coming from business leaders who are on the programme right now. This is what cohort 3 will look like, just to give you an idea of the topics that we cover, delivered by academic experts, and how they're being delivered. So approximately every 3 weeks, you have a face-to-face session. And right at the end, we'll be delivering a session on pulling it all together and helping you to implement it through your own growth plan, which of course is ultimately what we need to do. So, really do, have a little look at it. You can just type in help to grow management into Google, and you'll come straight through to the Small Business Charter website, where you can see the registration and you can see all of the cohorts that we have offered. We basically onboard every month. So our next cohort induction is the 30th of November, and it's actually signposted on the Small Business Charter website as the 7th of December, because that's when module 1 actually starts. So, don't delay. There's never ever going to be a right time to set aside some time for this. But, in many respects, what we do is help you to manage that time through the process. We're here to help and support businesses as much as we possibly can. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see some of the comments that people have shared. I took a great deal away just from the first module. I'll be sharing my thoughts with the management team. The sessions are well organised. We're friendly and approachable. Well, I'd like to think that we are. And I think there's my contact details there, Jane Lynch, cardiff@cardiff.ac.uk. Please do get in contact if you've got any questions, and I'd be more than happy to have a call with you, or to just respond by email, whatever works best with you. So please do help us to share the good news that we're delivering at Cardiff. And thank you very much, all of you, for listening and for this really engaging and enjoyable session this morning.
Thank you, Jane. And yes, I'll share these slides with everybody tomorrow. Please do get in touch if you're interested in that programme. I can get you in touch with Jane directly as well. So on that note, it's 9:30 and I'm going to draw things to a close this morning. I'd just like to once again thank Jacob Schneebacher for being with us this morning. Thank you so much, Jacob. Really appreciate your time. Melanie, I really appreciate you pulling everything together. It's very challenging keeping tabs on those questions as they come through. So thank you so much for doing that. And of course, thank you all for joining us this morning as well. Very grateful for your company. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am fod efo ni bore yma. Gobeithio'n iawn yn fawr fyddwn ni'ch gweld chi eto cyn bo hir. I hope we'll see you again before too long. Don't forget tomorrow's session at 9:30. It's still not too late to register for that. But we'll see you again soon. Until then, goodbye.